Shin Samich, on the left column, very, very bottom of the page. If anyone wants, we can take a picture of this and you can use it on your phone. Might be easier. So the very, very, very bottom column, it starts with the word v'yuvan zeh. Yisrael, you have that?
You got it, all right.
Okay. So yuvan zeh ba'od tosefes biur. We're going to understand this whole concept we just said with a greater explanation. Begam lahavin, lam b'kol pashat dafka. We also have to understand, why is it specifically this simple voice of the shofar, which accesses this inner dimension of Hashem's pleasure? So one more preface, and this is a mashal, which we sort of just went into now. Right? Like a person that is doing a work for some pleasure or will that he has in the work, like we just said. Certainly, he has to come up with some intellectual reason why he's doing it. And certainly, there is some inner intention behind what he's doing there. Not just I'm doing a work, right? He has a pleasure in it, but he has to come up with a reason, because certainly there is some kind of an inner intention behind it. Turning the page. And after he...
We don't have it on the...
So, you know what, if someone can put it on the group chat, I don't know, we kind of missed that.
No, that's not it.
Does anyone have it?
No.
But we didn't make the copy, okay.
Which page is this?
Take it from here. What's that? It's going to be page 720. Sorry about that, guys. I ran out of photocopies. Do you have a phone?
Yeah, good.
Let's put it on the group chat. We can all watch along here.
We're going so fast already.
We're flying, man. We're just flying. Okay, we're almost at the end. Sorry about that, guys. All right, let's take this page. Excuse us.
Yeah.
We'll just do one more while we're out here. I just can't take it. Okay. So is that on the chat?
Yep.
All right, so everyone please bring that up. Sorry you can't write on it, but at least you can see it. You're not on the chat yet. You are. Yeah, you guys can share? Okay, good for you. All right, so again, certainly there's an inner panemius kavana intention behind this work that he's interested in, had pleasure in. After he has this intention in it, nimshach seichel v'kavana zu l'midos shebelev. This is basically the same story we're just saying. So this intention that he has just conjured up is drawn down into the midos of the heart. Right? It brings itself to an emotional attachment to it. So believe that all of a sudden his heart is excited to do it. And then what happens? The emotions themselves, they also like eject into the hands, and suddenly he's now brought the energy all the way into the actual physical work. So what's happening? It's a whole process. The power of pleasure is flowing down pleasure into this work, right? First into the koach of seichel, the power of intellect. The koach of seichel mashpia seichel pnimius kavana lamidos. Then the intellect powers up the emotions. Lamidos hen mashpia lasiya, and the emotions power up the actual action. And one of our powers gets invested into the next one down the pike. This is how basically our whole system works, right? You first have some kind of a hatainug b'seichel. The pleasure goes into the intellect, right? In other words, so what starts the process is an intrinsic pleasure, right? It's almost like undescribable. Why does this guy want to play the piano and this guy wants to sing, right? It's like there's something in your soul which is drawn and has pleasure in this thing. And then you come up and the pleasure contracts itself into a reason. So most people think the other way around, that the reason is producing your pleasure, but pleasure is a previous koach, right? It's very high level. It's the kesser, and really that sort of is just like your soul's intrinsic leanings, and therefore it is the one that powers the reasoning behind something. So all of a sudden you now have a reason why you have this pleasure, right? It's not that the reason created the pleasure creates the reason.
Wow. There's definitely a distinction though between this like soul pleasure and like your desires and evil inclination. Are we making a distinction here?
Not necessarily when it comes to this flow, right? Also in your animal self. You also have intrinsic desires, right? Some animals like to run and break things. Some animals like to put their nose in stuff.
But okay, but
You know
then
what I'm saying?
that source is much lower.
It's a completely different lower source in terms of the fact that it comes from klippa,
Right.
but it still has the same
Dissension?
yes, dissension or pattern to it. So that's why you can't, if you notice, you can't sometimes really reason with your Yetzer Hara, because the reason is not the reason he's doing it, right? If you could like talk him out of it, that would be that because his interest in the thing lies in some kind of a reason. But the actual interest does not necessarily lie in a reason. It lies in some deeper inner pleasure, which all the reasoning in the world can't undo because it precedes reason.
I feel like it does the opposite. Like it creates all these reasons, whereas the soul desire has no reason.
That's exactly what we're saying, right? Isn't it? The pleasure then creates reason.
Okay, right, yeah.
So that's the whole point, that the pleasure creates reason. The reason then creates emotion. The emotion creates the deed. But what happens if suddenly you get tired, right? And your hands weaken from the work. You have to go back to the top of this chain and re-arouse the power of pleasure from the top. You have to your pleasure has to be reborn, which will then give over to the beginning of the intellect and the inner intention that you had in this work to begin with. That has to go back down to the emotions, and the emotions have to go back down to the action. And if not, you would stop doing the work. If the source is not continuously generating this whole process, then the whole thing just gets cut off. Because you just get tired. You sort of lose heart in what you're doing. You forgot what you're here for, right? And this is also obviously very practical in terms of getting anything done in your own life. This is how your whole system works, right? You have to, at some point, you have to really tap into the panemius. Why are you really doing this? And that's kind of why we learn Hasidus, right? In a Chabad yeshiva, because you have to constantly go back to this pleasure in Elokus. Because if you don't have that, then it's very hard to maintain a consistency in the whole rest of the process. You can't do that much with just simply Kabbalah's all the time, right? I'm going to do it because I started a job, I'm going to finish it. You won't necessarily finish it unless you remind yourself this whole process. There's an intrinsic pleasure, and then therefore there's an intelligence behind it, and therefore I love it, and therefore I'm going to do it. Wow. Certainly, it's obvious that the external aspect of doing the work, or this external aspect of the emotions that's in the work, certainly the work itself is not going to arouse that pleasure anew. Neither is the drop of intellectual powering that's inside of your emotions. It doesn't have enough grit to arouse that pleasure from anew, because it itself is just hanging on to its source. And cannot exist without being powered up. So these lower powers,
in our own endeavors,
even in your own endeavors, right?
Let's say you're making something and you get the result, and you're get so excited about the result that it gets you even more excited about continuing.
When you get the result,
that's generating pleasure.
That's generating pleasure. That's the whole point. When you get to the result, we're not talking about finishing the job. We're talking about you're in the middle of the job.
Yeah.
You don't have any results. On the contrary, what you have is toil, frustration, and the work of your hands. And if you don't constantly remind yourself what I'm doing here, you're why am I? Don't forget, doing a job with your hands is a tremendous, or doing a favor for another person, right? It's a tremendous bittul and contraction of yourself. You'd rather go do something else that's for yourself, that's fun, right? So if you're going to continuously contract yourself, you're not going to think about what you want to think about. You're not going to feel what you want to feel. You're going to just be funneling yourself into this very mundane activity. You better know that why you're doing it, and you better renew the pleasure in it all the time, or you'll just walk away from it. And the idea is the deed of doing it itself certainly does not have the stuff to arouse that pleasure. It's a recipient of the pleasure. It cannot be the cause of the pleasure. Finishing the job, I agree with you. Finishing the job is when you released all the pleasure. You're look at this geschmack. I just did a favor for my friend. I just made a table. It's so beautiful. That will remind you how much pleasure you have in this thing. But that's called finishing the job. We're talking about it being in the middle of the job. right? When the pleasure is clearly is the pleasure is contracted and contracted and contracted. I think we're up to 5 levels of contraction. You almost feel hardly any pleasure. So if you don't re-arouse the pleasure, you're going to stop the job. Where did we leave off? Okay. So this external.
Finishing the job is Rosh Hashanah.
It's kind of like living your life before you get to Olam Haba.
Yeah, basically, yeah. That's what I say. You have to like come back and like learn Chassidus every morning. You have to remind yourself the pleasure that you have in the service continuously, right? Or at least a good solid once a day or once a year at very least. Okay, so we can't say that the external action or the external qualities of the emotions, right, that are fueling this work will arouse the pleasure anew. Wow, so this is really a deeper thing. Even the inner intention and like the brilliant reason why you're doing this work will also not be sufficient. It won't arouse the pleasure because again, even the reason was a product of the pleasure, right? It will not arouse to open up a new flow of pleasure because the intellect, the intellectual reason and the intention here themselves, they themselves need a new dose of pleasure, right? They're also living on something beyond intelligence, right? It's an intelligence which is it's like a justification. In this area, your big mind is nothing more than a justification for your pleasure. Thank God it's a divine pleasure, let's say, but it's still not the reason for your actions. If you didn't have that pleasure, you wouldn't have that inner intention, and you wouldn't have all that intellectual framework backing up your project. Because it's really the flow of the pleasure which draws out the intention and the kavanah. And if that's true regarding the intellect, how much more so the midos, the maisa, the emotion and the action. Certainly I think it should be understood quite clearly now, they for sure cannot arouse the pleasure to come out. Somehow you have to go up into the very essence of the soul itself. You have to go to where the pleasure derives from, and that is, it's not something other than the soul. The soul is the one experiencing the essence. That's why we saw that the sphere of Kesser goes on pleasure. Right? And the sphere of Kesser, why is it called a crown? Because it's above the head. First of all, meaning it's above the intellect, right? It also means it's above any of the powers that sort of the soul projects as its sort of body and its instruments, which means the Kesser is actually united with the soul itself, which means your power of pleasure and will, which are the two aspects of the Kesser, they're not something other than your soul. Your wisdom is something other than your soul. Your wisdom is something that the soul produces in order to operate in this world. Your emotions, same thing. Your thoughts, speech, and action, they're like the machinery, so to speak, that the soul is operating in order to express itself. But the will and the pleasure, they're not. They are the soul. So if you want to arouse your pleasure, you have to go into the soul, the muhus hanefesh atzmo, the very essence of the soul itself. Because that's where pleasure stems from. Because the soul is the source of the power of pleasure. Therefore, only from the essence of the soul can you bring forth the power of pleasure. So we're saying, in other words, really what we're saying is even pleasure is some kind of a derivative. It's very, very united because the soul is in a state of, that's what the soul is, right? If you like go up to Hashem, what's happening over there? It says, Oz v'chedva bimkomo. It's like there's like strength and joy in his place, because if you actually get to God, it's just really like it's just a state of ecstatic pleasure. That's what like is going on in God all the time. Similarly, that's what's going on in your godly soul all the time, right? Now that ecstatic pleasure, the problem is it wants to express itself, right? And therefore, whenever you're going to try to express your pleasure, you need this clumsy instrument in order to do it. So the pleasure gets sort of lessened and lessened and lessened as it is transferring itself down into the mechanism which will ultimately bring its pleasure to fruition. But if you go all the way back up into its place, it's just one big pleasure sensor, right? But at the same time, the pleasure you could say it's like synonymous with God, but there's actually the essence of the soul, which is producing the pleasure, because even though Keser is above the head, it still is a sphera, right? It's just a unique sphere that's not part of like the grouping of the body of 10. So the point is that if you want to elicit the pleasure, you have to go actually to something which is higher than the pleasure, which is Hashem himself, the soul itself. And if you could touch that, just like we said, that the emotions come from the intellect, and the intellects come from the pleasure. If you want the pleasure to come out, you have to go to what's higher than the pleasure, if you will. And that's just you, like the essence of you. If you could touch the essence, then the pleasure will be an automatic byproduct. Right? Therefore, misham dafka, from there, from the essence, yacholios his orders. That's how you can arouse the power of tainug, that shiashpia tainug l'seichel, that it would suddenly make pleasure start to push its way down into the intellect and so forth.
This is why we need this sort of nullification of the self.
Right. That's why Rosh Hashanah is basically, along with the shofar, which is kind of like the crowning call of the whole thing. The avodah of Rosh Hashanah is absolute like selflessness, to the point of taking off all the garments to try to be at one with your essential soul. And then if that's not quite enough, because at the end of the day, you're still not giving that much pleasure to Hashem, no matter how much you serve Him. You need this instrument which taps into the essence. So in other words, you get to the essence. Then the essence pours out the pleasure to the intellect to the emotions, as we've been saying. And what happens here is that before we were talking about how the koach hamaskil, right, brings forth the power of intellect, brings forth either an idea or a seed. I'm sure you recall all that, right? And he says this is like the power of pleasure is required in order to draw that idea or that seed down. In other words, why do you suddenly have an idea? Why do you suddenly produce the seed? Right? It's really which the idea and the seed is the origin of the intellect, right? Or the origin of basically the intellect, right? And how does that come out? Pleasure has to precede it, right? You're only going to have the idea because it's pleasurable for you to bring forth ideas into your head or bring this seed. And this requires to arouse the essence of the power of pleasure. You can't just work from the standpoint of what's called the revelations, right? The revelations is that which is stemming off of the essence. If you're going to trigger any area of those revelations, that's not going to create new revelations to come out. You have to go to the source. You have to go to the essence from whence all revelations come out in order to produce new ones, in order to produce the process all over again. Because the revelations, even of pleasure, require their source to bring them forward, and that is the essence itself. So too, to bring forth a new brain power of Abba, like we've been saying, that should then be drawn down into the midos. You have to go to the essence of this light, not to its mere revelations, for the reasons that we said, and that should be suffice for the understanding man. Okay, everyone so far following along all this? Yeah?
It's cool to know that a yud looks like a shofar.
It is cool to note. Noted.
Yeah, I've noted it. Yeah.
Okay, going on. We're almost there. He says, Alpi mashal zeh, according to this whole mashal that we just gave, this whole process, Yuvan lamaski lamayla betam tekiya shofar bekol pashut velo bedibor. We can now understand why it is above that we have to have the reason of the blowing of the shofar with a simple voice and not arouse this essence with speech alone. We can't just like call our way up there. Kihine, because it's known. We just had the exact example of a person doing a trade. And the creation of the worlds from nothing is called by the name work. Where do you see that? Right? It says, Vayishbos mikol malachto. Hashem says, I rested from all his work. It's literally called a job. He's in the middle of a task. It's like a person who would be doing a physical activity. Right? So the creation of the world is merely, actually, just like the work of Hashem's hands. As it says, Sheishis Yamim Asa, 6 days you made. The word for made, Asiya, is the concept of a physical activity. And what we're going to go through this process once again. In the deed, what makes the deed go? Right? You have to have invested into it the emotions, the 6 attributes of Atzilus, which are called the 6 days of Maisa. So Sheishis Yemei Maisa, right? We have something called the 6 days of work. They're called that because they're opposed to, let's say, the 7th day, which is a day of Shabbos and rest. But at the end of the day, we call these 6 days Sheishis Yemei Maisa, 6 days of work. Why are there 6 days of work? We should understand this now. Because in order to get down to work, the simple work of your hands, that has to be powered by the emotions. In Hashem's case, in our case as well, there's 6 emotions. And so basically these 6 emotions, they each one of them expresses itself down one level and expresses the emotion, and therefore it's called Sheishis Yemei Maisa. It's really the deed itself is 6 times because the deed itself is being powered by the 6 emotions, the 6 middos of Atzilus. And how do those middos of Atzilus get there? How did Hashem get excited with these 6 emotions? From the Chochmah and Bina, from the mind. And that is exactly the analogy of the inner intention and the reasons behind the malacha, behind the deed that you're going to do. And as we said before, that you first have to have this like reason for doing the work, then the reason you get excited about it, and then that invests itself into the job. And so too with Hashem. Inside of that wisdom, you have to encloak a ray of the pleasure, the simple pleasure that comes from the atzmus of the matzil. What's the matzil? Talked about it yesterday. The emanator, right? You have the world of Atzilus, which is the emanations, and then the matzil, the one who emanates, right? So the simple pleasure of the emanator has to be going into that intellect. And that's the idea that it went up in his simple will to create the world of Atzilus and Bria. Why do we call it his simple will? What does it mean it went up in his Ratzon HaPashut? What's the idea of the Ratzon HaPashut?
And that is the Sephira Chachma that is in Keter.
Israel. Why is it called the Ratzon HaPashut? What is he giving us here? That the word pashut, that it's the will is simple, which is instructive over here.
I'm trying to say that like it's simple in the way that he chose to initiate with nothing like initiating him. Like there was.
Yeah. In other words, go. You want to say more? So the idea is that if something is not pashut, not simple, it means it's compound. Right, it's made up of parts, and you can have a will that's made up of parts, right? And that's the idea that, for example, when you have a reason, so you have a bunch of parts, basically like a rationale. So that also it can produce a type of will, and the type of will that produces is actually called an emotion. Emotion and will are actually quite close to each other. In fact, the word for ahava has the word ava in it, which means will, right? But the difference is it says in the Zohar is ratzon ve'is ratzon. There's will and there's will. There's 2 types of will. One is a ratzon hapashut. One is a simple will, and one is a compound will. So when you have a compound will, it means the will is a derivative of the reason, and that's really like an emotion. When we're saying here we have to go all the way up to the top into Hashem's ratzon hapashut, that means there's a simple will which is not based on anything. There's no series of compound ideas which is producing. On the contrary, it's simplistic. It can't be explained, and that's what we're saying. You have to go up into the essence. Why does Hashem create the worlds? There is no reason for it, right? After all is said and done, all the masters of Kabbalah throughout the generations gave it a go. They came up with the final answer: that why did Hashem create the world? He desired a dwelling place in the lowest world. And we say that a desire is not a reason. It's just a desire. And so when you say, why is this all here? It's not reasonable, right? It's a desire in its source of all sources. It's a ratzon pashut. It's a simple will which cannot be broken down. If you want to then take that will and cloak it into reason and then cloak it into emotion, we can come up with all the reasons. But the reasons come after the initial interest in doing it. right? So that's what we have to reach up to, right? We have to find out what made Hashem tick. How was his essential desire, aroused to begin with? He did it by himself, basically, because no one was there to arouse it. So this is what is required for him to get into this 6-day work-a-day week, right? He has to go all the way back up to the emotions, to the intellect, to the ratzon hapasha, the simple will. The kol shah, haimerapi yadav lasos brias olamos, and therefore, really, all the while where he's making the worlds, right? Once you arouse the will, it goes into the intellect and all the way down, so he's making the worlds. But as soon as that happens, as soon as you start the job, you're tired already. Because the will is hiding behind reason, and the reason is hiding behind emotion. The emotion is cloaked into this very low. You're not really the love, busy in the job. Anyone who's like a real craftsman knows that it takes a tremendous level of discipline to just like keep yourself in the game, even though you sat down on this project, you might have spent $100,000 to go to school for this, but you still would rather close the book and get up from it because it's extremely trying you. Right? And that's the idea, that your hands get weak from the job. And in Hashem's case, his hands get weak from the job of creating the whole world. Unless, at least once a year, there can be this arousal anew of the essence of his pleasure. Which again, will draw down a pleasure into the chokhmah, into the midos, into the maisa, as we said in the mashal. And as we said before, you cannot arouse this by thinking, by intelligence. How much more so by midos, by emotion or speech or action? None of it can do it. They are all derivatives. They can't cause the chain of events. They're in the end of the chain of the events. You have to go back to the essence of the emanator, from which it shines the power of simple pleasure. So he will give it over to the chokhmah, which is called Panimius Abba. And from the Panimius Abba, Batzilus, it should get drawn down to the midos, to the speech, to the action. Therefore, it's impossible to do it, to arouse this with speech, and also not with intellect or emotions. A little bit repetitive, I agree. Rak B'chin is kol pashut. And therefore, how do we get to it? That's where the kol pashut comes in, right? We have like one tool in our bag. Speech cannot do it because speech is this great derivative. But what's unique about the kol pashut, the simple voice from the hevel halev, right? Because we said that this intermediary, if you recall, what is the definition of an intermediary? Let's go back to the first preface that we started. What's the definition of an intermediary? Yes, David, on the ball.
It contains a part of the high level and a part of the low level.
Exactly, that's its definition. And since that's the case, suddenly it looks like we do have, even though we're at the bottom of this chain, we have an intermediary, right? And if we have the intermediary in our hands, that means, because the intermediary also connects with the lower level. So in other words, we have like a hand in that, but then an aspect of the intermediary also is associated with the essence and the higher level. Right, this simple voice that comes out of the breath of the heart, the kol pashut hu b'chinas atzmus mashpia. We said the sound aleph, right? The higher end of the aleph, right, is that it gives it's the lowest aspect of the essence of the heart. And therefore, when you're holding that intermediary in your hand, you do have an aspect of the essence in your hand. But the good news is it also has the source of the lower end inside of it, right? So this is like the secret of the shofar. We need something that's going to somehow reach the essence of Hashem. Where do we have around here that reaches the essence of Hashem? We need to find an intermediary, where inside the intermediary, the highest end of the intermediary touches the essence of Hashem, albeit it's the lowest part of the essence of Hashem, but being that it's the essence of Hashem, it reaches there. And fortunately for us, it's not, it can trigger a relationship with us as well, because it also contains inside of it the highest part of the receiver, right? So it's like a divine tool. V'hu os havaras aleph. We said this is essentially the aleph. which is basically the Aleph, right, is the source of all the other 22 letters, as we said in the first preface. So on one hand, the Aleph is really not really letter-like at all. What it is just like an absence of making space for the breath of the heart to be able to come out of its very, very refined status of being united with the heart and basically just have a presence. So that presence is still the essence of the heart. It's the lowest part of the essence of the heart. It's the part of the essence of the heart that can show up, right, like on the screen. You following what I'm saying there? But at the same time, it's attached to this Aleph, which holds inside of it the keys to the 22 letters, which means that it can also be transferred down and express itself all the way down to the lowest levels. So the shofar is this tool. It's the intermediary, right? Al-kin aidedekiyas b'kol pashut zeh, right? Because we're making a simple sound. And the simple sound is basically an intermediary between the lowly worlds and the essence of Hashem, because it has in it both those two things. It has the essence of the heart, and it has all the speech, right? And we already said that that intermediaries sort of go up. One intermediary is connected with the higher one. So once we're connecting with like sort of our essence of our heart, it attaches to the essence of Hashem. So blowing with this simple voice, it does arouse the essence of the mashpia. Speech can't do it, but this simple voice can, because it's the intermediary, and it not only arouses the essence of the mashpia, but it has a mechanism to connect to the receiver as well, because inside of that intermediary it also has the source of the lower worlds, the letters. And what we have here, therefore, is this exact process. It's the ability to not only arouse the essence of pleasure, but that the essence of pleasure should also give over to the intellect, right? Because it has a bridge to the lower realms. And then also the essence of the power of seichel, which is that seed-like aspect of the mind that can also go down, right? Because and connect with the midos, because it has the lower part of the intermediary as well. And what he's saying is you go from essence to essence, right? The essence of the tainug to the essence of the intellect to the essence of the emotion, and all of a sudden it comes out neshamas, which is basically the product of the reproduction of the essence of Hashem. Right? There's two ways to go down the Seder Ishtalshlus, right? An external way, which is like ideas, which creates angels and then worlds, or an internal way, which creates ultimately the seed of Hashem, which creates neshamas, right? Adam Arishon. So he's saying the shofar specifically, which you blow on Rosh Hashanah, today, by the way, is Chaf Hei Elul. So today is not a regular day, right? Today is like an unbelievable, today's the day that this whole process happens from the external aspect of Hashem. Hashem is basically recreating all of existence today. You feel that? Right? From his external aspect, and that produces a new world. And by the time we get to Rosh Hashanah, where we blow the shofar, we're not needing to create the world in the same way. We're now creating the internal dimension where Hashem's inner essence, not the expression of the essence, but the inner essence itself goes through the pike and creates neshamas. And that's what he's saying now. It goes from essence to essence, from the essence of pleasure to the essence of the mind, to the essence of the midos, which means from the essence of the emanator himself to arouse the essence of the pleasure, and then from the essence of the pleasure to arouse the essence of the koach ha-seichel, etc. And all this is because the simple voice is this unique device which arouses and has a common language with the essence. And at the same time, it's an intermediary. It also has a common language with the lower reality, and therefore it can bring essence and send it down to all the realms and levels. Okay. We have 3 minutes left. My feeling is maybe we should hold here though, because we got to the end of this paragraph. Okay, my friends, let's get ready for slichas.